On March 26, 1975, the Biological Weapons Convention was established, a treaty with the goal to effectively ban the development and production of biological weapons. To this day, 187 states have signed this treaty. But why was such a treaty necessary in the first place? In this video, we'll take a closer look at biological weapons and how they have been used throughout history. So without further ado, welcome to Infectious Insights. This is a brief history of biological warfare. But before we can dive deeper into the history of biological warfare, we first need to answer the following question. What exactly are biological weapons? Biological weapons are defined as any form of microorganisms such as viruses, bacteria or fungi, or their toxic products that are released deliberately to cause disease and death in humans, animals and plants. Actually, such organisms and toxins are not at all a rare thing in nature. In fact, more than 1,200 different kinds of potentially weaponizable biological agents have been described so far. So with the definition of biological weapons out of the way, let's look at some of the early examples of bioweapons use in history. What might first come to mind when we think of biological weapons could be some kind of sophisticated, bioengineered weapon of mass destruction. But really, the beginnings of biowarfare were much more humble than that, and the use of biological weapons dates back much further than you might expect. One of the earliest documented examples of something that we would consider today biowarfare dates back to Italy in 1155. It was here that the Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, also known as Emperor Redbeard, after several failed attempts to take the city of Tortona and even after using specialized engines to drill holes to undermine the city's defenses, allegedly ordered his men to use corpses to contaminate the garrison's water supplies, thereby trying to force the defenders to give up the city. Roughly 200 years later, in 1346, during the siege of Kaffa, it is described that the Mongol army used catapults to propel dead bodies of plague victims over the city walls. Plague, also known as the Black Death, is caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. There are different disease manifestations in plague, but for example, the form that we call bubonic plague is very deadly, with estimated 30 to 90% of infections resulting in death if the infected person is left untreated. While the plague also wreaked havoc among the Mongol army, it is believed that this tactic had a devastating effect on the inhabitants of Kaffa, as the disease spread rapidly, causing panic and chaos and ultimately forcing the defenders to flee the city. In another example, in 1495, the Spanish were reported to have mixed their wines with blood from leprosy patients to sell to their French adversaries. And in 1763, British settlers distributed contaminated blankets from smallpox patients to the Native Americans. Smallpox is caused by variola virus, a highly contagious virus that the Native Americans likely had never encountered before. It is not clear whether the use of the contaminated blankets or simply the contact to the European settlers was the reason for spreading this disease. Today, it is difficult to estimate the actual effectiveness of these early uses of biological weapons. At the time, people did not yet fully understand the underlying mechanisms of what is causing many of the observed diseases. It wasn't until the 19th century when the groundbreaking studies by Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch and other scientists on the theory of germs led to a modern understanding of the existence of microorganisms and that microbial pathogens are in fact the cause for many of the observed diseases. Suddenly, it was possible to select biological agents based on the disease they would inflict and study them to make them even more effective and deadly. Already this early on, people realized the potential dangers of this new knowledge on microbes. Therefore, already in 1874 in Brussels and in 1899 in The Hague, two international declarations were crafted with the aim to prohibit the use of so-called poisoned weapons. While these agreements were made to put a stop to the dangers of using biological agents as weapons, they ultimately failed as countries like Germany, Britain, the United States, Japan and Russia started to develop chemical and biological weapons on their own. Shortly after, during World War I, the world would witness the use of toxic chemicals in warfare to an unprecedented extent, killing thousands of soldiers using poisonous gases. It was also during World War I that the German army would be the first to deploy biological weapons, while only with limited success. In small covert sabotage operations, German secret agents were sent out with microbial cultures containing anthrax and glanders, a disease that mainly affects horses, donkeys and mules, and were instructed to infect animal shipments to the Allies to weaken their war efforts, as these animals were still largely used for transportation. After World War I ended, with only a fragile peace in Europe, research and development of biological weapons continued, reaching a scale never seen before. In 1930s Japan, the radical nationalist Shiro Ishii started his own research on biological weapons and would later, during the Second World War, head Japan's infamous bioweapons program, later also known as Unit 731. At its height, Japan's bioweapon program would employ over 5,000 people. During this time, Ishii and his men would test over 25 different pathogens on prisoners and unsuspecting civilians. Later, these agents would also then be used to systemically contaminate thousands of water wells in Chinese villages, resulting in outbreaks of cholera and typhoid fever. Planes were also used to drop plague-infested fleas over Chinese cities or to distribute them in rice fields and along roads. Even years after Japan had capitulated and the war was over, China would see outbreaks as a result of these deployments. While some members of Unit 731 were convicted of war crimes by the Soviets, the US would grant freedom to all researchers as part of a deal to receive information for their own bioweapon experiments. So many of the Japanese researchers were not prosecuted. They were reintegrated into society and would later even found successful pharmaceutical companies. For example, Masahi Kitano, second in command of Unit 731 and Shiro Ishii's successor, later even published his research findings, replacing the word human with monkey when referring to the human experiments conducted during the war. After Japan, also the US would start its own biological weapons program in 1941, which grew during the war to up to 5,000 employees until 1945. After the Second World War, the US military continued their research and started open-air testing of biological weapons. One such test program was called Operation Whitecoat, which was conducted at Fort Detrick in Maryland, where conscientious objectors, mainly conscripts who refused to perform active military service, volunteered as test subjects to be infected with pathogens and to study their effects on the soldiers, as well as the efficacy of medical treatments and vaccines. While test subjects in Operation Whitecoat were volunteers, the US would later also test biological agents on unsuspecting civilians with both harmful and non-pathogenic microbes. In open-air tests, the US government would secretly spray clouds of bacteria over populated areas in the US to study the population's vulnerability to biological weapons. However, with the growing opposition to the Vietnam War and the realization that biological weapons could become a so-called poor man's nuclear bomb, President Nixon stopped the offensive biological weapons program in the US, and the US signed the Biological Weapons Convention. Despite signing the Biological Weapons Convention themselves, the Soviet Union would secretly continue to develop biological weapons on a scale that has never been seen before. In his book, Biohazard, Ken Alibek, the former deputy director of Biopreparat, writes in chilling detail about how the Soviet Union stockpiled tons of weapon-grade anthrax bacilli and smallpox virus. There were even plans to release these pathogens using intercontinental ballistic missiles capable to reach almost any place in the world, potentially killing millions. The truth is, no one really knows what happens to these bioweapon stockpiles after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is not clear if they have been fully destroyed or instead might have fallen into other hands. I am planning to make a separate video on Biopreparat in the future, so if you're interested, make sure to subscribe to my channel and get updates on all new videos. But in the past, there have not only been governments trying to get their hands on biological weapons, there were also examples of individuals and non-government groups that use biological agents to inflict harm in society. One incident that is still considered the largest bioterrorist attack in the US occurred in Oregon, when in 1984 members of the Rashnish, a cult-like religious movement, used Salmonella bacteria to contaminate several salad bars with the goal to prevent the local population from voting in the county's election so their own candidate would win. In the end, luckily not a single person died from the attack, but 751 people were identified that suffered from Salmonella gastroenteritis connected to the incident. 9 years later, in 1993, another religious cult, the Aum Shinrikyo, sprayed anthrax spores from the roof of their Tokyo headquarters. What could have resulted in a massive anthrax outbreak would in the end turn out to be unsuccessful, as the spores released by the cult were not infectious. In contrast, a successful bioterrorist attack using anthrax occurred in 2001 in the US, also known as Amerithrax, due to its FBI codename. It was shortly after the attacks of 9/11 that letters laced with anthrax spores were sent via mail to US Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy and to media offices. Ultimately, 5 people died and 17 fell ill from anthrax, rendering this the worst biological attack in the US history to date. As you can see, history is full of examples where humans have tried and used biological agents as weapons. It is really worrying to imagine what could happen if such weapons would be used today in our globalized world. While the Biological Weapons Convention is an attempt to control the development and production of biological weapons and has reached almost universal membership in the United Nations, effective verification mechanisms to check whether all nations are upholding the treaty remain difficult. Actually, US intelligence suggests that there are still several countries conducting active bioweapons research. More so, some experts believe that recent advantages in bioengineering, synthetic biology, and even artificial intelligence have made the development of biological weapons more accessible and easier than ever. What is evident from history, though, is that many of the allegations of bioweapons use in the past have turned out to be false, and might in fact have been used as justifications to engage in conflict and even justify own bioweapons research. With the amount of misinformation we see today, I personally think we have to be careful and critical when evaluating risks and benefits of biomedical research. Let me know what you think in the comments. Also, this has been my first video, so please like, share and subscribe to my channel, and the sources I used are listed in the video description.